Welcome back everyone. Today we will be talking about medieval homes. What are medieval homes? Brief history about medieval houses. Pros and cons of medieval houses in modern times. Hi and welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about medieval houses. Before we get into the video of today, first things first, when was the medieval period? The period of European history extending from about 500 to 1400 to 1500 CE is traditionally known as the Middle Ages. The term was first used by 15th century scholars to designate the period between their own time and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The medieval era, often called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, began around 476 AD following a great loss of power throughout Europe by the Roman Emperor. The Middle Ages span roughly 1,000 years, ending between 1400 and 1450. Now the medieval times were in most cases referred to as the Dark or Middle Ages. This was a less developed period, but even in a time so ancient, they still had luxurious houses amongst the houses of peasants, as they were referred to back then. They were the houses of lords and they were called manors. During the European Middle Ages, the dwelling of the lord of the manor or his residential bailiff and administrative center of the feudal estate. You're probably asking what a bailiff is. Well, those were minor court officials with police authority to protect the court while in session and with power to serve and execute the legal process. In earlier times it was a title of more dignity and power. The medieval manor was generally fortified in proportion to the degree of peaceful settlement of the country or region in which it was located. The manor house was the center of secular village life, and its great hall was the scene of the manorial court and the place of assembly of the tenantry. The particular character of the manor house is most clearly represented in England and France, but under different names. Similar dwellings of feudal overlords existed in all countries wherein the manorial system developed. In England in the 11th century, the manor house was an informal group of related timber or stone buildings consisting of the hall, chapel, kitchen, and farm buildings contained within a defensive wall and ditch. In the 12th century the hall, which throughout the medieval period was the major element of domestic architecture, was placed defensively at the first floor level and contained within a moated enclosure. Later it was planned at ground level, as in Oakham Castle, Rutland, within a more strongly defended enclosure. By the 14th century, the manor house plan was clearly defined, with private living apartments and service rooms at opposite ends of the Great Hall and with battlements, gatehouse, and moat, as at Hideham Moat, Kent. Ockwell's Manor in Berkshire is a typical timber-framed manor house built in the 15th century without defensive elements. In France, until the end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453, considerations of defense dominated manorial buildings. Such early manor houses as the 14th century Commersac Manor in Gironde consisted primarily of a rectangular fortified tower in a walled and moated enclosure. In Normandy the Angot Manor, near Dieppe, reveals some advances in domestic planning in the 15th century, the house standing at one end of a courtyard, flanked by farm buildings and defended by a gatehouse. With increased prosperity and the desire for more commodious dwellings, the 16th century manor house evolved into the Renaissance country house. In England, more elaborate buildings were constructed, reflecting a new era of formality. The houses were frequently of the regular quadrangular plan, with the hall diminished in size and importance. Later the hall was reduced to the status of an entrance, as at Ramsbury Manor, Wiltshire. The defended tower house tradition persisted in France throughout the 16th century, generally retaining corner turrets and other defensive archaisms, as in the Tyrrell Manor, near Troyes. In later years the title of a manor house in England lost particular significance, having been adopted by large country mansions that had no manorial foundation. Pros and cons of medieval houses. Pros: one of the very few pros of medieval manors was the spacious rooms and beautiful gardens. This pro is for mostly the lords of the manor. Things weren't really looking good for the help. The lords had an immense amount of comfort as they had multiple servants at their beck and call. Cons: 1. Poor energy efficiency. Period homes can be among the worst for energy efficiency, simply because building materials like insulation weren't as good as they are today. Original features like sash windows can look incredible, but may also allow lots of heat to escape, while medieval homes often have no roof insulation. 2. Damp problems. Damp-proof courses only became a legal house building requirement in the late 1800s, so properties built before this time suffered with damp problems. People always kept their eyes out for dampness in aged medieval homes, including brown marks or discoloration on walls, signs of mold on walls and ceilings, bubbling plaster or wallpaper that is peeling away. 3. Poor renovation work. In the 1950s and 1960s, period homes were considered old-fashioned. So, buyers often ripped out original features like fireplaces and decorative cornices or undertook other unsympathetic renovation work. Reinstating those features can be really costly. The society in the Middle Ages of Europe was based on a feudal system, where the large areas of land were given to the nobles and divided between the local lords with English heritage and an individual manor. The medieval house that nobility and lords lived in was well built and furnished, whereas the medieval houses the peasants lived in were dark and cold. The early medieval housing had weak designs with poor materials used by the peasants, and these houses were not substantial for them to use fire inside to cook or stand the bad weather and had to undergo lots of repairs. Later, peasants' living improved with workers' demands due to the Black Death. A new building style with wattle and daub was invented that allowed peasants to build taller and broad medieval houses. This medieval house was made of wattle, timber, and mud. They were not very spacious, but they still protected them as a shield from weather, and they could use fire inside the house to cook. Medieval housing also has a hole in the top with a thatched roof used as a chimney to let the smoke out. The fire helped them feel warm and cook inside the house. So the new design was successful in a protective shield from weather and fire. The medieval house of noblemen was substantial and still stands as evidence of their super quality. These medieval housings were made of stone, unlike the ordinary people. In the 13th century, the earliest form of medieval period cottages was built for the nobles. Such splendid cottages are still strong and exhibited in the Open Museum in England. The early medieval homes of the nobles had two rooms. One room was for the lord of the manor and his family to sleep, and another room was with fireplaces used for heat, cooking, and eating. Servants slept in the great hall. Their crops and animals were locked up in primordial barns outside the house. The buildings were strong, made of stones, and protective. Later the nobles upgraded to medieval period houses built with bricks. As bricks were very expensive, they were used only for walls, and timber was used for interior and support. Tudor houses were also built during the medieval period. It's half-timbered, made of wood for walls, interior, and tiles for roofs with chimneys and windows. Tudor medieval house had 2 floors, added floor for the servants or a separate building. Cleaning the houses was done with water, and early tools such as broom, brushes, and sponges were used. Wealthy people hired a maid to do the job. People in the medieval period built their own houses with available materials like a wooden frame, straw thatched roof, and walls with branches. Later in the Middle Ages, the rich used stones and bricks, and the most wealthy built a stone castle. Medieval castles were giant and made from stone. The castles are 3 kinds: the modern Bailey Castle, the concentric castle, and the stone keep castle. Castles have an interior with a staircase, hallways, bedrooms, storerooms, a chapel, barracks for knights, and a gatehouse. Medieval architecture had a timber frame, panels filled with wattle and daub. Twigs were weaved in and out to make the wattles, which will be daubed with a mixture of clay, cow dung, mutton fat, and straw. Once dried, cow hair and lime plaster were used to patch the cracks. Bricks and shaping natural stone were very expensive, so was used only by the rich. Townhouses in East Grinstead were 2 stories, with small frontage and 12 feet, 3.2 meters, wide. The 14th century was popular with jetties which made more room for the upper story, also protecting the lower level from the intense weather. Wheeled-in houses were more popular, which was substantial. Ideation of medieval houses. Classical, medieval architecture style has influenced, merged, and redefined their ideas, styles in our homes in the neighborhood deep with their roots. Traveling back in times, in the 5th century after the fall of Rome and before Renaissance culture and fashion flourished, Church buildings were dominant, but architecture on the domestic with clustered thatched roof houses in villages and Italian tiled roof hill towns, windows, walls framed with stacked stone or timber frames. Many styles were adapted from medieval architecture, adding their classical details to materials used, characteristics, simple form, massing, or their irregular shape marking their roots in folk or vernacular architecture. Some of these architecture styles include saltbox houses, Gothic Revival style, tidewater houses, transitional Gothic style, shingle style, Tudor style, and Queen Anne. So to round up our video, yes, the medieval manors fell under the category of luxury homes, but they weren't all that great, as the larger number of them dished out ill treatment to their servants at the time, and it was a period filled with wars. That would be all for today's video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.